The wound had no name. That was what my healers told me, one after another, as they filed out of my chamber with their satchels pressed to their chests and their eyes fixed anywhere but my face. 14 of them over the course of 7 weeks. The finest herb keepers in the Ashenwold kingdom, summoned from every holding between the Grayville River and the Iron Peaks, and not one of them could name what was wrong with me. They could see the mark easily enough, a jagged line of blackened silver running from my left shoulder to the center of my chest, pulsing faintly at the edges like a coal that refused to go out. They could feel the fever it fed. They could hear what it did to my wolf at night, when the dark pressed down and the great beast inside me stopped pacing and started clawing. But none of them could say what it was, and none of them stayed. The last one, a gray-bearded man from the southern settlements who had reduced 3 war generals to weeping children with his remedies and prided himself on having seen every affliction a Lycan king's body could carry, stood at my doorway for a long moment after he had gathered his things. He wanted to say something useful. I could see it in the set of his jaw. He looked at my shoulder where the wound pulsed, and then he looked at the window where the moon was rising, and then he looked at me. "It is not of the body," he said finally. "Then what is it of?" I asked. He shook his head and left. My second, Gavrik, closed the door behind him and stood with his back to it. Gavrik had served 3 kings before me and had a way of holding silence that was itself a kind of speech. He was holding it now. "Say it," I told him. "I have nothing to say that will please you." "Say it anyway." He crossed the room and stood at the window, looking out at the Thornwoods, that great stretch of ancient forest that ran for 60 miles along Ashenwold's northern border. The trees were dark shapes against a sky gone purple with evening, and the wind was moving through them in long, slow rolls, and there was something about the way they moved that made you feel the forest was breathing. "There is a woman," Gavrik said, "in a village called Crestfin at the edge of the Thornwoods, a healer, not trained in any hall, no school, no guild, no proper credentials. She has no wolf of her own, or so the border riders say. She keeps a small house, tends the sick in the villages along the forest's edge, and has a way with wounded animals that the people in those parts call something between a talent and a miracle. Word has come to me, twice now, that she once walked into the Thornwoods alone when a pack of feral wolves had gone sick with a strange madness, and she came out again 3 days later, unharmed, and the wolves followed her to the tree line and lay down." I looked at him. Wolves followed her. Feral ones that had been snapping at anything that moved for a month. "She is not Lycan." "No. She has no wolf." "None." "And you think she can do what 14 trained healers could not?" Gavrik was quiet for a long moment. "I think," he said carefully, "that the man who told me it is not of the body may have been right, and I think the only thing left worth trying is something outside of what we have tried." He paused. "I could send for her." "Do not send for her," I said. "A person brought here under a summons from a king doesn't come freely. She comes afraid or she comes obligated, and neither of those is useful to me." I pushed myself upright from the chair. The effort cost me more than I showed, and reached for my cloak. "Tell me which road leads to Crestfin." He stared at me. "You cannot travel to the border in this condition." "I traveled through the Grayville campaign, in worse condition than this." "You had an army with you." "And now I have a wolf," I said. "Arguably more dangerous and certainly less noise." I settled the cloak over my wounded shoulder, careful not to press the fabric against the mark. "Ride with me. Bring Aldrin and Court and 2 others, men who know how to be quiet. No banners, no regalia. Tell no one where we are going." Gavrik looked at me the way men look at a king who has made up his mind and is not going to unmake it. "And if she turns us away?" "Then we ride back," I said, "and I live with the wound until it kills me or stops, but I would rather hear a no from someone who actually knows what they are looking at." We left before the moon had fully risen. The road to Crestfin was 3 days' ride on a good road, and the road to Crestfin was not a good road. It was a track, mainly rutted and narrow, threading between stands of old ash and birch that pressed closer as we went north, until by the second evening the forest was so near on both sides that I could have reached from my saddle and touched the bark. My wolf didn't like it. He never liked close spaces in those weeks. The wound had made him edgy, and edgy in a confined Lycan wolf meant a low, persistent vibration in my chest that Gavrik could not feel, but my horse certainly could. I did not tell the others how bad the nights had been. The wound pulsed more sharply in the dark, and the beast inside me paced, and sometimes the pacing turned into something else, something that took all my attention to hold. I lay still in my bedroll and breathed through it, and in the morning I rose and rode and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The wound would kill me or it wouldn't. In the meantime, we rode north. On the third morning we came over a ridge and the forest opened, just briefly, and there was Crestfin below us, a scattering of stone houses around a mill pond, a few fields put in for winter wheat, a road that ended at the tree line of the Thornwoods as though it had simply given up trying to go any further. Smoke from chimneys, a dog barking somewhere, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary place. Gavrik leaned in his saddle. The border rider said she lives at the north end of the village. Nearest house to the forest. I could already see it, a small stone house with a slate roof and a kitchen garden at the side, the garden gone to frost but still tidy, the beds mulched and covered with care. Bundles of something hung drying from the eaves. The door was open. "Stay here," I said to the others. "My lord," Gavrik began. "Stay here, Gavrik." I rode down alone. I heard her before I saw her. She was around the side of the house, in the kitchen garden, and she was talking. Not to another person. I could see that as I came around the corner of the building and dismounted. She was talking to a wolf. A young one, barely past pup size, its gray-brown coat patchy in the way of animals that had been through some hard time, its left foreleg wrapped in clean linen strips. It was sitting still under her hands with a docility that was, to put it plainly, not natural in wild wolves. She did not look up when I came around the corner. She was focused on whatever she was doing with the wolf's leg, checking a knot in the bandaging, I thought. And she was talking in a low, even voice. The kind of voice you use to keep a frightened animal from remembering it is frightened. "I know it pulls," she was saying. "I know it will pull less in 2 days, be still." The wolf flicked its amber eyes to me. The woman felt it shift and looked up. She was perhaps 30, or near to it. A plain face, not plain in the way of being unremarkable, but plain in the way of being honest. No effort to be anything other than what it was. Dark hair pulled back from her face and tied at the nape of her neck. She wore a simple wool dress, deep brown, and over it an apron that had seen a great deal of use. Her hands, where they rested on the wolf's back, were a healer's hands, careful, calloused in the places that came from work rather than from weapons. She looked at me steadily for a moment. She did not appear alarmed. "Do you need something?" she asked. I had prepared what I was going to say on the ride down. Something measured, a reasonable explanation, an honest account of the wound and its history, a clear request. But standing there, looking at a woman who had a feral wolf sitting peacefully under her hands while she checked his bandage and asked me if I needed something, the prepared words went somewhere I couldn't find them. "A man I trust told me you might be able to help," I said, "with a wound that other healers have not been able to name." She studied me for a moment. Her gaze moved to my left shoulder without my directing it there, as though she already knew where to look. "Take your cloak off," she said. "Not please, not if you don't mind, just take your cloak off." I found I didn't mind. I unfastened the cloak and let it fall over the fence rail, and she rose from her crouch by the wolf, dusting her hands on her apron, and came to stand before me. She was not a tall woman. She stood perhaps to my collarbone. She looked at my shoulder with the same focused quiet she had given the wolf's leg, and then she reached up. "May I?" she said. Yes, I said. Her fingers were cold from the morning air. They pressed very lightly against the edge of the wound, not the blackened center which no one touched, but the outer rim where the silver pulsed. She was very still. I watched her face and she watched the wound, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. Inside my chest, the wolf went quiet. Not calm, I want to be precise about this. He did not settle the way he sometimes did when the pain eased briefly. He simply stopped. All the pacing and the low, restless vibration that had been the background of every hour for 7 weeks just ceased. Like a sound you had grown so accustomed to hearing that you forgot it was there, until suddenly it was gone, and the silence it left was enormous. I held very still. How long? She said. 7 weeks. What caused it? I don't know. I was on the border on patrol and I came through a place in the thornwoods where the trees grow close and the ground was wrong, hollow sounding. The way ground is over old burial sites. And when I came out the other side, the wound was there. I paused. No blade, no arrow, nothing struck me. She moved her fingers slightly along the edge of the mark, and my wolf stayed quiet. Stayed. After 7 weeks. I had not thought it possible. It is of the thornwoods, she said. She wasn't speaking to me, really. She was speaking the thought aloud, the way someone does when they are working something out. The wound is not a wound exactly. It is a binding. Something in the forest recognized you and could not reach you, so it... She stopped. Her brow furrowed. Who was the last healer you saw? An old man, gray-bearded. He said it was not of the body. He was right, she said. It is a tether. The forest left a mark on you the way roots leave marks on stone, pressing towards something, looking for something. It will keep pressing until either it finds what it is looking for or it goes deep enough to. She stopped again. It will keep pressing, she said more carefully. Until it kills me, I said. She looked at me. Yes. There was something almost a relief in hearing it said plainly. Every other healer had circled around the word, let it hover just outside the sentence. She just said it. Can you reach what it is looking for? I asked. She was quiet for a long moment, her hand still resting at the edge of the mark and my wolf still entirely, strangely silent. I don't know, she said. I would have to go into the thornwoods, to where it began. She said this in the tone of someone stating a fact, not requesting anything, not asking my permission and not seeking my approval. She was telling me the mechanics. That is not safe, I said. She looked at me with a mild patience that reminded me, unexpectedly, of Gavrik when I said something obvious. There are safe things and there are necessary things, she said. They are not always the same. I stood there looking at her for a moment. She held my gaze without difficulty, no deference, no anxiety, no particular effort to seem unaffected. Just steady. I am going with you, I said. You're injured. Yes, I said. That is precisely why I am going. She did not argue further. She went inside and came out with a pack, organized, clearly assembled by someone who had done this before, and she took a moment to speak to the wolf in the garden, check his water, and latch the gate of his pen with the careful thoroughness of someone who expected to be away for more than a few hours. Then she looked at me. There are men with you, she said. It wasn't a question. She'd seen them on the ridge. Yes. They should not come into the thornwoods. I thought about arguing. I thought about Gavrik's face when he saw me ride back up the ridge with a border village healer and tell him we were walking into 60 miles of old forest. I know, I said. They'll wait at the tree line. She nodded as though this were settled. We walked back up to the ridge. Gavrik saw us coming and read my face with the efficiency of long practice and said nothing about the woman at my side, which was one of the many reasons he had been my second for 11 years. We walk from here, I told him. Take the others and make camp at the edge of the tree line. Do not come in after us. My lord, Gavrik said, which was the word he used when he wanted to say several things and was choosing to say none of them. Give it 3 days, I said. If we haven't come out in 3 days, send word to Aldrich at Stonehaven." Gavrik looked at the woman. She looked back at him with a calm that apparently satisfied him, or at least neutralized his objections, because he gave a short nod and pulled the horses to the side of the road. She and I walked into the Thornwoods. The forest changed within 50 yards. I don't mean the trees grew thicker, though they did. I mean the quality of the air was different, older, heavier, carrying a kind of weight that had nothing to do with humidity or cold. The light came in long slants between the trunks and fell on the ground in pale patches, and the ground itself was different from the forest floor of ordinary woodland, mossy and soft, deeply layered, as though centuries of leaves had pressed themselves down into something almost like cloth. The silence was very large. She walked without hesitating. She had a way of moving through the forest that I studied without meaning to, not careful exactly, but not careless either. Aware. She noticed things: a twisted root, a stand of dark-capped mushrooms, a place where the moss grew in a different direction. She didn't comment on most of them. But she changed course more than once without explanation, and each time she did, I felt the wound in my shoulder react not painfully, but responsively, like a compass needle pulled toward north. "You feel it," she said, without looking back at me. "Yes." "Tell me when it pulls harder." We walked for most of the morning. She stopped twice to examine plants, once to listen to something I couldn't hear for a long minute before nodding and adjusting our heading. She asked me questions as we went, methodical questions, nothing wasted. What the wound felt like at night versus in the morning, whether the pain was worse in rain, whether I'd been near wolves when it began. I answered all of them honestly. There was something in the way she received the information, taking it in and using it, not performing concern or sympathy, just working, that made it easy to talk. "What is your name?" I asked at some point, because I had ridden 3 days to find her and stood in her garden and agreed to walk into the old forest with her, and had not yet asked. She glanced back, a small, faintly surprised look as though the question was unexpected from me. "Saren," she said. "I am." "I know who you are," she said, and looked forward again. I wasn't sure whether to be surprised that she'd known or that she hadn't mentioned it. "And you still agreed to come," I said. "You're not asking me to heal a Lycan king," she said. "You're asking me to help someone who's sick. Those are not the same thing." I thought about that for a while as we walked. We crossed the flooded crossing near midday. I had not been told about a flooded crossing, but Saren seemed unsurprised to find it, a wide, fast-moving stream that had overrun its banks and spread into the surrounding low ground, turning 100 yards of forest floor into a shallow, cold, and deceptively uneven wading field. The water was knee-deep in some places and thigh-deep in others, and the current pulled steadily at everything it touched. The light here was gray, filtered through ash trees that had dropped their leaves and now stood bare-armed against a white sky, and the sound the water made was a continuous low voice, insistent and cold. Saren stopped at the edge and read it for a long moment. I had noticed this about her already. She did not make quick decisions. She gathered what she could before she moved. She looked at the water, and she looked at the far bank, and she looked at the place where the current broke against a half-submerged root mass, and then she looked at something I couldn't see, something beneath the surface or beyond it. "The bottom is layered stone," she said at last. "Limestone, mostly flat-bedded. There's a line through it, come to my right." "How do you know the bottom?" I asked. She gave me a brief sideways look. "The water moves differently over stone than over silt. Watch the surface where the current is steady, that is bedrock. Where it roughens, the bottom is loose." She looked at the crossing again. "Also the Thornwoods told me." "The Thornwoods told you?" I said what I said, she replied, and waded in. We went in together. She was right about the bottom. The footing was solid if you knew where to put your feet, and she seemed to know without hesitation, picking her line through the crossing with the confidence of someone who had done this many times in many places. She moved slowly and she moved well, holding her pack clear of the water with one arm extended, and the cold was sharp enough that I could see her breath, but she made no sound about it. The water pressed at me with a steady insistence. I was a larger man, I carried more weight, and the current read that and pushed accordingly. But it was manageable, and we made good progress toward the center. I watched the wound as we went. In water, in the cold, in motion, it was behaving differently. Instead of the slow, grinding pulse I'd grown accustomed to, it had taken on a faster rhythm, more alert, as though the thornwoods all around us was reading it at close range and responding. Not worse, different. Midway across, a surge came through and pushed hard, a pulse of water from somewhere upstream, faster and higher than anything that had come before it. Saren stumbled, her right foot coming off the limestone shelf she'd been tracking, and I reached without thinking and caught her arm, and she caught my wrist. And for a brief moment, we were simply holding on to each other in the middle of a cold river in the middle of an old forest, the water pulling at us both and neither of us going anywhere. She found her footing. We stayed still for a moment while the surge passed. "Thank you," she said, when the current had settled back. "You're welcome," I said. She did not let go immediately. She looked at where my hand was on her arm, not at the hand, but at the mark on my shoulder, which was doing something I could feel distinctly even through the cold. It had begun to pulse with a warmth I hadn't felt before. Not the burning of the wound, which was pain moving inward like a blade. Something else. Something that moved outward from the mark in slow, widening rings, like a stone dropped in still water, except that this stone had warmth at the center, and the rings of it were reaching toward the woman whose wrist was in my hand. Her eyes went briefly to the mark, back to my face. "Interesting," she said quietly to herself, in the tone of someone noting an observation they will need to return to. She released my wrist. We went on. I did not let myself think too closely about what I'd felt, standing in the river with her hand on my arm, and the mark spreading warmth outward for the first time in 7 weeks. There were things a wounded king needed to think about and things he did not, and this was the thornwoods, and the far bank was 20 yards ahead, and I needed my feet. I put it away and walked, but I put it away with the full knowledge that I would take it out again later and look at it properly, and it would mean exactly what I suspected it meant. The wolf pack's gauntlet met us in the late afternoon. I heard them first, a low, continuous sound, not quite a growl, more like a gathering of breath in many chests at once, as though several sets of lungs were deciding something together. Saren heard it at the same moment I did and lifted her hand slightly to stop me. We stood still. The forest around us was very quiet otherwise. The trees were close here, old and heavy-limbed, the trunks dark with moisture, the roots visible where they surfaced before diving back into the earth. The light had gone low and amber, slanting hard through the upper branches. They came out of the trees in a loose, wide ring. 7 wolves, not pups, not young animals, full-grown Thornwoods wolves, silver-gray and pale-eyed, heavier through the chest and shoulder than the wolves of the southern packs. They moved without sound, each one appearing at a different gap in the trees as though the forest had placed them there by arrangement, and they stopped when the ring was complete. They were not attacking. Their posture was not the crouched, ready position of wolves that intend violence. But they were not letting us pass either. They stood in a half-circle before us, watching, and the sound from their chests was a low, continuous pressure that said, "Here and no further." My own wolf stirred in response. The response was complicated, not aggression, not fear, something older than either of those things. He recognized these animals or some quality in them, the way you recognize the sound of a bell you have not heard in many years. But he was still compromised by the wound, and the compromise showed in the raggedness of that recognition, the difficulty of holding steady. I breathed and held him. "Be still," Saren said softly. I wasn't sure if she was speaking to me or to the wolves. Perhaps both. Perhaps it didn't matter, it was good advice regardless of the recipient. She lowered herself to one knee, slowly and without sudden movement, and set her pack down beside her. She reached into it and took out nothing. She simply set her hands on her knees, palms up and open, and looked at the wolves. Not at all of them, not at the ring as a whole. At the one in the center, the largest, the oldest, a wolf with a scar running through one eyebrow that suggested he had been in one fight too many and had survived it, and the kind of stillness in his pale eyes that comes from years of watching rather than from any particular temperament. She looked at him the way she had looked at my wound, attending without demand. The wolves were still for a long moment. The old scarred one held his ground and held her gaze, and I stood behind her and kept my breath even and let my wolf be as quiet as he could manage, which was quieter than I'd expected. Something about her presence steadied him even now. Then the large scarred wolf lowered its head, not all the way, not the posture of submission, but an inch, a degree, the deliberate incline of an equal acknowledging another, and took a step forward. Saren did not move. The wolf came to her and pressed its nose briefly and firmly against her outstretched palm. The low sound from the pack's chest dropped away into silence. The ring opened. I let out a breath I had not known I was holding, and I felt in my chest my wolf do the same. A long, easing release, not quite relief, more like the setting down of something heavy that has been carried a long way. We walked through the ring. The wolves tracked us with their eyes but did not move, and as we passed the large scarred wolf, I found myself looking at him. He looked back at me with those pale, ancient eyes, and something passed between us that I would not have known how to explain to anyone who had not stood in a similar place, a recognition, or a reminder that I was a king of wolves too, and the wound I carried was not mine alone, and the woman walking ahead of me had something to do with all of us. When we were through and the trees had closed behind us, I said, "How?" Saren adjusted her pack and walked on without slowing. "They weren't asking us to turn back," she said. "They were asking who we were and what we meant," she walked on. "I told them." "You told them?" "Not in words," she said, "but yes." I thought about the open palms and the steady gaze. "And me," I said. The old one looked at me. "He wanted to know if you deserved her," Saren said. "Her being you." "Her being me," she confirmed. "And his conclusion." She glanced back at me over her shoulder, the ghost of something in her expression that was not quite amusement but was in the same neighborhood. "We're still walking," she said, and faced forward again. "The cursed grove found us at dusk." I say it found us because that is how it felt. We did not walk into it so much as it arranged itself around us, the trees shifting and thinning until we stood in a circular clearing, perfectly round, perhaps 20 yards across, where no undergrowth grew. The ground here was bare earth, dark and fine as ash. At the center stood a single stone, old, unmarked, roughly the height of a man's chest, half buried in the earth. The wound in my shoulder ignited. Not the low pulse of the past weeks. This was full ignition, a deep, burning surge that ran from the mark outward through my chest and down my arm, and I stopped walking and stood still because the alternative was going to my knees, and I was not going to my knees. I breathed through it. Saren was beside me in a moment, her hand at my arm, not gripping, just present. "This is the place," she said. "Yes." "Stay still for a moment." She moved away from me toward the stone and stood before it. She set her hands on it very gently, and she was quiet for a long time, so long that the dark had deepened around us and the first stars had appeared between the branches before she moved again. When she turned back, her face was difficult to read. There was something in it that looked like wonder and something that looked like trouble. "Tell me," I said. "The Thornwilds is alive," she said. "Not in the way of animals or people, in a different way, an old way. It has a will that is made of time rather than thought." She came back toward me carefully. 300 years ago, this kingdom's first Lycan king made a compact with the forest. The forest would hold its borders, keep its wolves, and protect the kingdom's north. In return, the king would send his fated mate, his true mate, whichever one the moon designated, to the forest, so that the bond could be witnessed and sealed here, in this grove, before the throne. She stopped in front of me. That compact has been honored every generation until now. I looked at her. Every generation until now, I said carefully. You have not brought your fated mate to the grove, she said, so the forest reached out and took hold of you. Her voice was steady and honest. The wound is not a punishment, it is a reminder, an insistence. The forest is asking you to fulfill the compact. The night around us was very still. No wind, no sound from the wolves. There is a difficulty, I said. Yes, she said. I have no mate. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the forest seems to believe otherwise. I looked at her. She looked at me. In the dark of the grove, with only the first stars for light and the dark earth beneath our feet and the old stone at the center of the clearing, something happened that I had not planned for and could not have prepared for, not in the way the wound had happened, not like a striking or a binding, more like a recognition that had been there all along, waiting for the quiet to become loud enough to hear it. It had been there when she pressed her fingers to the edge of the mark in her garden, and my wolf went still for the first time in 7 weeks. It had been there when she caught my wrist in the cold river, and the mark sent warmth outward instead of inward. It had been there when the wolves of the Thornwilds read her palm and stepped aside. I had put each of these things in a careful box and set it on a shelf in the back of my mind and told myself I was concentrating on the forest and the road and the wound, and all of it had been true, and none of it had been the whole truth. The whole truth was standing in front of me, looking at me with a healer's direct, assessing gaze, waiting to see what I would make of this. Saren, I said. Yes, she said. You know what I am going to say. I think so, she said, and I want to be clear that you don't need to say it on account of any obligation to the forest or any compact or any wound. Those things were pointing towards something, but the pointing is not the thing. No, I said, the thing is the thing. She held very still, and what is the thing? I had never been a man who struggled to speak plainly. It had been one of the easier gifts of kingship, clarity, directness, the willingness to say the true word in the true place. But standing in this grove, looking at a woman who had walked 3 days' worth of difficult ground without complaint, who had brought a feral wolf to stillness with her bare hands, who had told me I was dying with the honesty of someone who believed I was owed the truth, I took a moment to be certain. The thing, I said slowly, is that I have been aware of you since you looked up at me over that wolf's back in your garden, and everything that has happened since has been clarification. I looked at her. My wolf has been silent since the moment you touched the wound, not subdued, not quieted by the pain, silent in the way he was only once, years ago, in the presence of my mother, who could settle him when nothing else could. It is not a small thing for a wolf to go silent. She was very still, watching me. I don't know what this is, I said honestly. I know what the forest believes it is. I know what the compact says it is. I know what my wolf has been telling me since this morning, which he is now telling me quite loudly. A pause. But I am not the forest, and I am not the compact, and I am not even entirely the wolf. I am also a man. And as a man, I am asking you, separately from all the rest, whether any part of what you have felt on this road is something you would choose to stay with. Not as an obligation, as a choice. The grove held its breath. Saren looked at me for a long moment. She had that quality of stillness I had watched all day, not immovable, not closed, but genuinely thoughtful, a person whose silences meant something. When you caught my arm in the river, she said at last, I felt something I could not account for. I told myself it was the cold or the current. She paused. I have been telling myself many things since this morning. Yes, I said. I have lived at the edge of the Thornwilds my whole life, she said. I have gone into it many times. It has never pulled me toward something before. It has always simply let me move through it. She glanced at the stone at the center of the clearing. Today it pulled me toward this place. She looked back at me, toward you. The mark on my shoulder had gone warm, not burning, not the scorching pain of the wound. Warm in the way of a hearth, in the way of held hands. "What do you want?" I asked. "Not what the forest wants. Not what the compact says. You." She took a slow breath. "I want," she said carefully, "to understand what this is before I name it anything. I am not a court woman. I don't know your world. I have a house in Crestfin and a practice and a wolf with a broken leg in my garden who needs his bandage changed in 2 days." She said this with a kind of rueful clarity, not as a refusal, but as an accounting. "And I know almost nothing about you, except that you rode 3 days without a banner to ask for help rather than demand it. And you let your man stay on the ridge. And you walked into this forest with a wound that should have had you in bed. And you asked me what I wanted." "These seem like reasonable criteria," I said. "They seem like a beginning," she corrected. "Which is different." "Yes," I said, "I know the difference." She looked at me a moment longer. Then she reached out and laid her hand, very gently, over the mark on my shoulder. The pain left. Not gradually, not in stages. It simply went, and in its place was the warmth, flooding outward from the mark to every edge of me, and inside my chest my wolf lifted his head and made a sound I had never heard from him before. Not a howl, not a bark. Something quieter, something satisfied. Saren's eyes went wide. She felt it too, I could see it in her face, the widening, the slight catch of breath. She looked at her hand against my shoulder and then she looked at me. "The forest," she said. "Yes," I said. "It is accepting." "Yes." She let out a slow breath. We stood very still in the grove, her hand on my shoulder and the mark warm and painless beneath it, and the old forest breathing around us in the dark. "I would like to go home," she said eventually, "and change the wolf's bandage." "Yes," I said, "and then?" She considered. "And then," she said, "I think we have a great deal to learn about each other." "We have time," I said. "You don't know that," she said, but not unkindly. "You're a king. Kings are not renowned for having time." "I will make time," I said. "That is the one thing I can absolutely do." She almost smiled. Not quite the near smile, the one that lives just before the full expression and sometimes means more than the full expression. "Then we have a beginning," she said. We slept in the grove that night because it was too dark to attempt the return, and because the clearing held a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. Whatever the Thornwolds had been waiting for, it was pleased, and it made us comfortable in the way old forests sometimes make you comfortable when you have done what they needed. I kept watch. Saren slept without apparent difficulty on her bedroll, curled on her side with her pack under her head, and I sat with my back against the old stone and watched the stars through the gaps in the canopy and listened to my wolf, who was so quiet and so whole that I kept reaching for the pain out of habit and finding nothing there. He was at peace. The wound was gone. Not faded, not healing, gone, as cleanly as a fever that breaks in the night. In the morning I would pull back my tunic and there would be smooth skin where the black silver had been, and Gavrik would look at it with an expression he would never quite put into words, and my horse would stand steady under me for the first time in 7 weeks. But that was the morning. In the night in the grove, I sat against the stone and thought about a woman with dark hair and honest hands who had walked into the Thornwolds without flinching, and spoken to feral wolves, and told me I was dying, and asked me what the thing was when I said I was going to say something. I had known many people in my life. I had known great warriors and careful scholars and loyal seconds, and scheming counselors and people of every kind that a court and a kingdom produce. I had not known very many people who, on first meeting a Lycan king, asked him if he needed something. I liked it very much. We came out of the Thornwolds the following morning, and Gavrik was at the tree line as I had asked, and his face when he saw us was composed in the particular way of a man who has spent the night preparing several responses, and is now discarding all of them in favor of a careful waiting. "My lord," he said. "We are well," I told him. "How are the horses?" "The horses are well." He looked at my shoulder where the wound had been. He looked at Saren, who was slightly behind me, attending to her pack. He looked back at me. "We ride for Crestfin," I said. "One night there, then Stonehaven." Gavrik took this in. "One night in Crestfin," he said. "There is a wolf who needs his bandage changed," I said. A long pause. "Of course," said Gavrik. The wolf in the garden was sitting upright when we arrived, watching the gate with an alert, slightly accusatory expression, and he softened visibly when Saren came through it and went straight to him. I stood to one side and watched her check the bandage and replace it with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything, speaking to the wolf in that low, even voice, telling him what she was doing, asking him to be still. My second was very carefully not looking at me while I watched her. "She is not Lycan," Gavrik said, at a volume appropriate for me and not for her. "No," I said. "And she has no wolf." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "The wolf is listening to her," he observed. "The wolves in the Thornwilds did as well," I said, "including 7 large ones who very much did not want to." Another silence. "The wound." "Gone," I said. I heard him exhale, a small, restrained sound that in anyone else would have been a great and shuddering breath of relief. Gavrik had been worried for 7 weeks. I had not said so, he had not said so, and neither of us had needed to. "The compact," he said. He knew the compact. Every senior man in my household knew the history of the kingdom going back to its founding. "The grove." "Yes," I said. "And she?" "I asked her," I said. "I asked what she wanted. She said she wants to understand what this is before she names it anything. She says it is a beginning." I paused. "I think she is right." Gavrik was quiet for a long moment. "Is she coming to Stonehaven?" "Not yet," I said. "I will come back." "You will," he stopped. "My lord." "I will come back," I said, "as often as I can, and when she is ready, if she is ready, then she will come." I looked at him. "She is not going to be summoned. She is not going to be hurried. She is a healer who lives at the edge of a living forest and has a practice in this village and a wolf with a broken leg that she does not intend to leave until he is whole." A pause. "We understand each other on this." Gavrik looked at the woman in the garden, who was now scratching the wolf behind his ears and receiving what appeared to be an enormous amount of gratitude for it. "She told a pharaoh wolf to be still," he said, "and it was still." "Yes," I said. "And 7 large ones in the Thornwilds." "Yes." "And yours." I looked at him. "I heard the difference," he said quietly. "Last night when you came out of the tree line, your wolf was quiet. I have not heard that in 7 weeks." "No," I said, "neither had I." He nodded slowly once, and said nothing further, which was his way of saying everything he needed to. I stayed one night in Crestfin, as I had said, and it was a quiet evening and a good one. Saren made a meal in her small kitchen, and we sat at the table and talked, the way people talk when they have been through something together, and are now in the ordinary world again, and discovering that the ordinary world is not smaller than what they have been through. It is, in fact, where most of the real things live. She told me about the village and the forest, and the years of walking the tree line alone and learning what the Thornwilds would allow. She told me about a woman who had taught her, years ago, an old keeper of the border settlements who had died when Saren was 20 and left her everything she knew. She told me about the wolf in the garden, found 3 weeks ago at the bottom of a ravine, and her careful hope that he would be whole enough to return to the wild when his leg had healed. I told her about Ashenwold, honestly, not grandly. The keep at Stonehaven, which was large and cold and would benefit considerably from someone who knew what to do with a kitchen garden. The council, which was meticulous and occasionally exhausting. The wolves, who had missed their king's steadiness in these 7 weeks more than I had allowed myself to acknowledge. I told her about Gavrik, who had ridden 3 days without a question asked, and kept camp at a tree line for a night without complaint. "He was watching you when you came out of the forest," she said. "He watches everything." "He was watching you specifically," she said. "He loves you, not in the way of just, he does." I thought about this. "Yes," I said, "he does, he would not put it that way." "No," she said, "men like that never do." She said this with a warmth that was not pity and not condescension, just recognition, and a kind of affection for the type. I looked at her across the table, in the candlelight of her small kitchen, and thought, yes, there it is. That is the thing. The morning I left, she came to the gate with me. Gavrik and the others were already mounted on the road, at a diplomatic distance. The wolf in the garden watched us with bright eyes from behind his fence. We stood at the gate and looked at each other. "I'll come back," I said. "I know," she said. There was no performance of uncertainty in it, just acceptance, clear and quiet. "I will be here." "The forest," I started. "The forest is patient," she said. "It has waited 300 years, it can wait a little longer." She looked at me steadily. "So can I." I thought about all the things I could say. I thought about the grove and the stone, and the warmth that had flooded out from the mark when her hand settled over it. I thought about a healer who had walked into the thornwoods and brought 7 wolves to stillness, and told a king he was dying and asked him plainly what he wanted. "Saren," I said. "Yes." "The wolf will be fully healed in how long?" She thought 3 weeks, 4 to be sure. "I will be back in 4 weeks," I said. Something moved through her face, not a smile exactly, but the thing that lives near a smile and is sometimes more honest. "That is a long ride," she said. "It is," I said. "Yes." And she looked at me, and I looked at her, and in the early morning light at the gate of a small stone house at the edge of the thornwoods, with a wolf in the garden and my second waiting with elaborate patience on the road, we understood each other entirely. I came back in 3 weeks. I could not manage 4. The road was no better the second time, and no faster, and I didn't care about either of those things. I came over the ridge above Crestfin in the late afternoon of the 20th day, and the smoke was rising from the chimney of the small stone house at the north end of the village, and there were bundles of herbs drying at the eaves, and the wolf in the garden was standing on 4 solid legs. She was in the garden when I came through the gate. She looked up and I looked at her, and neither of us said anything for a moment. "Then he can walk," she said, and nodded at the wolf, who was regarding me with a calm suspicion that suggested he was healed but not particularly ready to be grateful about it. "He looks well," I said. "He is," she said. "He'll go back to the forest in a day or 2. She wiped her hands on her apron. "How is your shoulder?" "Entirely whole," I said. "Good," she said, and then, in exactly the voice she used when she was done with the preliminary questions and ready to address the real matter, "Come inside." I will not make a long account of the months that followed. They were good months, and good months are not well served by long accounts. What I can say is this. I came and went between Stonehaven and Crestfin, sometimes for days, sometimes for a week, and she came twice to Stonehaven, and met the council with a composure that Gavrik later told me privately had impressed him more than almost anything he had seen in 40 years of court service. She did not come to court. She came to a home that happened to have a throne in it, and she treated it accordingly, which was one of the reasons the council, after initial murmuring, became quiet. In those months I learned her in the way you learn someone when you pay close attention, the way she moved through a room, which was always with purpose, never idly, the way she listened to people, which was entirely, without the partial attention most people give while waiting to speak, the way she laughed, which was less frequent than smiling and more genuine than both. I learned that she kept meticulous records of every herb, remedy, and patient, in a hand so small and precise it looked like the notations of a scholar, that she slept lightly and woke early, that she had no patience for ceremony or pretense, but enormous patience for difficulty, for pain, for the long, slow work of healing something that did not want to be rushed. She learned me, too, with the same careful attention. She asked the right questions, the ones that required honest answers, and she listened to the answers with the directness she brought to everything. She told me, once, partway through those months, that she had been frightened of almost nothing in her life except becoming necessary to someone, because necessary things, when they break, take everything with them. She said this the way she said most difficult things, plainly, as though honesty were simply more efficient than anything else. I understood that she was telling me something important about what it cost her to be here, to be learning me, to be allowing herself to be known. "You are very brave," I told her. She looked surprised. "I walked into the Thornwilds." "That too," I said. The Thornwilds knew when she was at Stonehaven. The northern wolves were calmer. The border scouts noticed, and sent word with a kind of amazed efficiency that told me they had been watching and had drawn their own conclusions. She moved to Stonehaven in the spring, quietly, without ceremony. She brought 2 trunks, her supply of herbs, and a large and somewhat imperious attitude about what would be done with the empty plot on the south side of the keep, which was receiving good light, but had been wasted on gravel for as long as anyone could remember. Within a season it was a working garden. Within 2 seasons it had become, without anyone quite deciding this, the place where people of the household came when they had a thing bothering them that they could not name, because she was usually there, and she listened well, and the herbs smelled good, and it was easier to speak plainly outdoors. The compact was honored on the autumn equinox, in the grove in the Thornwilds, with only Gavric and 2 border riders as witnesses. No ceremony of the court, no audience. The forest didn't need an audience. It needed what it had been asking for, and when it received it, the grove lit with a warmth the witnesses said they still cannot quite describe, and the old scarred stone at the center put out a single pulse of silver light and then went still and at peace. She never wore a crown easily. She was honest about that, and I loved her for the honesty. She wore it when it was needed, and when it was not needed she was in the garden or in the forest or at the edge of the Thornwild speaking to whatever animal or injured creature had recently arrived at the keep gate, which was, it turned out, a great many of them. The Thornwild seemed to have decided that Stonehaven was now a reasonable place to send its wounded, and I did not argue with the Thornwilds about this, having learned better. The wolves of Stonehaven had opinions about her from the first week. The opinions were uniformly favorable, a point they made plain in the way wolves do, by arriving at doors and lying down there, which they did to her door in such numbers that Gavric eventually arranged for a wider threshold. My wolf had no opinions to make plain. He was simply settled, in the way he had been in the grove, in the way he had been when she first laid her hand against the mark in her garden at Crestfin, settled down to his bones, quiet and content, as though he had been looking for a particular quality of silence all his life and had finally found it. I know the feeling. Gavric asked me once, late in the first year, what I would have done if the wound had never come, if the forest had not reached out and bound me, if a gray-bearded healer from the south had not been the 14th to fail and had instead found a remedy and healed the mark, and I had never ridden north. I thought about it honestly. I think, I said, that I would have ridden north eventually anyway. He raised an eyebrow. 14 healers, I said. And I asked the 15 people who knew her best, which was the border riders, and they said she walked into the Thornwilds alone and came out 3 days later with feral wolves following her to the tree line. I looked at him. I have lived in a wolf kingdom for 40 years, Gavric. A woman who can bring feral Thornwilds wolves to the tree line and lay them down. I would have gone to see that eventually. He considered this. The wound was more efficient, he said. The wound was considerably more efficient, I agreed. But the forest did not give me something I would not have found another way. It simply shortened the road. Gavrik was quiet for a moment. Then, she would have sent you away, he said, if you'd arrived without the wound. Without a reason she could use. I thought about her in the garden, looking up at me over the wolf's back, asking, "Do you need something?" "Yes," I said. She would have been polite about it, but yes. So the wound was necessary after all. I looked out at the courtyard of Stonehaven, where the garden had overtaken the south wall in a way that was making certain members of the guard unnecessarily agitated, and where, at this moment, the woman who was my Luna and my mate, and the keeper of this household's animals, and the living satisfaction of a 300-year compact, was crouched by the wall, inspecting something in the cold earth with the focused quiet she brought to everything. The wound, I said, was the forest's way of asking me to pay attention. I should have been paying attention already, but I was paying attention to the wrong things. A pause. She is the right thing. Gavrik made a small sound that he would have described, if pressed, as acknowledgement. I knew it as the sound he made when he agreed entirely and considered the matter closed. Outside, she stood from her crouch and looked toward the keep, and I think she felt me watching. That was a thing that had developed, a thread between us that the grove had sealed but the months had strengthened, a warmth that moved in one direction and was answered from the other. She looked toward the window and she found me, in the way she always found me, without effort. She raised her hand. I raised mine. The wolf in my chest, who had been, ever since a cold morning in a garden at the edge of the Thornwilds, the quietest and most content he had ever been in 40 years of my life, made no sound at all. He simply lay down and rested, and the warmth moved between us across the courtyard, and that was enough. That was, in fact, everything.